Hey everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing Fantasia. This film came out in 1940. There were a lot of people involved in overseeing the film, so there's not one specific director. There are multiple segments throughout the movie, but the core idea itself comes from, of course, Walt Disney. He wanted to create a new theatrical experience, a very ambitious one that's melding what was essentially considered highbrow, which is like classical music, with something that might have been considered a bit more lowbrow, like cartoons, animation. Every time I watch this movie and doing my research for it, I can't help but think that that was just a really ballsy move made by Disney, whether he was making decisions more out of genuine passion or if it was more for financial gain. I can't really be sure, but you can certainly say that the man did take risks. Of all of the animated films made by Disney, this one for me is easily the most perplexing. I'm genuinely surprised that it was able to find such a big audience through re-releases and such. Yes, I mean, certain images are iconic, and that's quite evident when you watch the film, but I'm surprised that the entire film is recognized the way that it is, because when you watch other Disney movies, they're not like this one. They're far more accessible, more narrative driven, more palatable to the average person, the average moviegoer. Of course, Disney is a huge part of my childhood. As I've grown older, like a lot of people, I have struggled with it at times. I am conflicted a little bit morally with it and in terms of what the narratives themselves reflect, but I also applaud it for being so innovative and having such imagination, such creativity at other times. But as I said before, Fantasia is just not like other American films, especially at the time. It doesn't have any real narrative, and it's not confined to the same expectation that you have for other animated films of its type. For me, this is by far the most interesting Disney film, and it's easily my favorite of all of them. That's not to say I'm crazy about all of it. There are certain segments and certain parts of the film that I struggle with that feel a little bit disjointed in terms of flow, but overall, I think that this movie takes more chances, and it is so artistically bold, and it sort of pierces through what is expected, what is literal. It feels like it's taking you through this very hazy, dreamlike area of the mind. And that's a kind of intimate place to be, especially when you're watching something that you consider to be entertainment. And maybe that's the place where dreams are made of. That is maybe the place where artistic expression is formed within the brain. And the way that it captures this essence to me is extremely mature, extremely sophisticated, very perceptive. And it does have a very meditative feel to it, in the same way that 2001: A Space Odyssey has a very meditative feel to it. Lots of long, soporific sequences where it feels as though nothing at all is really happening, to the point where you're almost bored by it. And whatever you're seeing, of course, in both films is typically set to booming classical music. The meditative aspects of it and how it's sort of lulling you into that soporific area of the mind is what causes it to push beyond what is expected, and it pushes beyond what you are able to feel, what is easily grasped. It's a far more psychedelic and cinematic experience to me, and it's drawing you in where you're not necessarily so much captivated by it, but it's like you're falling into it, as though the screen itself is like an abyss. When you are experiencing these long, stretched out sequences like this, where there's not a lot of stuff happening, you're not stimulated in the same ways you normally would be, you start to go to weird areas of the mind where feelings and things you're used to, the literal things, are no longer concrete as they were. They start to become more abstract. And for me, this is kind of what the film is doing. It is a journey through almost the creative psyche. It feels like you're sitting in a symphony hall, the music begins, and you just close your eyes and you're just transported through your imagination. You're letting your mind just float to wherever it wants to go. Or it could be like you're at home and you're looking at the ceiling and you just dropped a tablet of acid or something like that, and you're listening to The Rite of Spring. And interestingly, it wasn't until Fantasia was re-released in the late 1960s that it received this resurgence and it started to gain all of these fans. This time it was more college students, because again, it was the late 60s, so there's all that free love and psychedelics going on. In 1940, it had such a big budget and it was so ambitious, it just didn't make its money back. And I mean, I think there are multiple reasons for that. It could have had to do with international distribution. Of course, there was a war going on, which certainly I think affected things. But I do think it was just kind of ahead of its time. I think it does belong more in among the 1960s movies than it does movies of the 1940s. Not to say that it's necessarily a psychedelic movie in the literal sense, but it does lend itself to that experience, and you can interpret the film as such. It certainly does feel like an evolving trip when you watch it, and I love how the movie is divided into 3 categories of music. The ones that do tell a definite story, and then you have the ones that don't necessarily tell a story, but the images are clear and you can recognize them. And then there are the totally abstract segments where there's no coherence, as if you're just throwing all the literal things you've known out the window. Overall, I think they have a really good selection of music here, ranging from all different time periods and different styles. I do love the opening, the toccata and fugue section. Great piece of music to introduce us to this journey. And it's introducing us in a way that it's saying, no, this is going to be a very creative, very meditative odyssey. It begins very literally when you're literally watching a symphony and they're all playing their instruments. But then color starts coming from the instruments as they play. Then you're starting to see fairly abstract images of like bows playing against a backdrop of clouds, we'll say. And then those shapes you recognize cease to exist at a certain point. Everything is dissolving behind your eyelids. Like you're taking those first steps to really getting somewhere creatively. If you're a creative person, you know that feeling when you can feel something is happening and all of your senses start to kind of open up and you feel something blossoming inside. It can be a lonely sort of place to be, but a very empowering one. And I think that those shapes and all those abstractions and everything are really setting the perfect stage. And then it shifts into the Tchaikovsky section where it's certainly a fantasy, but I wouldn't say there's a clear narrative, just kind of images that we may recognize, and they're moving and they're fluctuating with the music coming alive in a different sort of way. They're not taking the literal stories. You're not seeing Tchaikovsky's The Nutcracker. You're not seeing that actually depicted on screen. You're seeing dancing flowers and mushrooms. Then it's moving on to the Sorcerer's Apprentice section, which of course is a definite story, and it's perhaps one of the strongest segments to exhibit that definite story portion. It's certainly the most iconic section, I would have to say. It is truly fantastic in every way. The music is fantastic. The animation is fantastic. The story builds so beautifully. It's funny. It's scary. It's everything that you could want in an animated short or animated segment, I guess. The Rite of Spring is another one of note, and I think that this particular section is proving just how ballsy these animators were, just how ballsy that Walt Disney was, because Rite of Spring is if you're familiar with the piece, it is a very dissonant, experimental piece of music, not to mention a very controversial piece of music. When it premiered, there were riots. And when you think about it, the piece was only like, I don't know, 30 years old, maybe, not even, when this came out. So I feel like it might have been received differently compared to how it is now. People praise it. So for that to be one of their selections, I think is very, very, very cool. It is a very mature piece of music. I don't think of it as something you would see in a cartoon, because it feels very adult to me. It's very violent, very primal, very sexual, and just overall aggressive music. And it is one of my favorite pieces of all time. And I love what they did with it. The music is set to the animation of, like the evolution of species on Earth, the beginning of time. Having the dinosaurs and such is just genius to me, because the music, as I said, it has that primal, just unrelenting sort of quality to it. So I feel like that gives you, it's a great template for you to really go for it as an animator. You get to be really dark and be really intense if you want to. I remember being a little kid watching this movie, and I saw it so many times, but the part with the T-Rex and the dinosaurs scared the shit out of me. It is by far the longest section in the film, and it doesn't use the entire piece of music, unfortunately, but it uses a lot of it. I mean, I want to say that it's like nearly 20 minutes. And their willingness to go there, as I said, is just really admirable. It's one of my favorite parts of any Disney movie ever. But like I said, not all the segments are working for me the same. I was never really a fan of how they utilized the Beethoven Pastoral Symphony or the Dance of Hours. I don't think anything is wrong with them necessarily. They just they feel beneath the rest of Fantasia. They don't have the same thrill, the same excitement, that cinematic density that a lot of those other ones do that I mentioned. Nor are they particularly interesting in terms of color palette or animation. They just feel misplaced when you compare it to the rest of this sort of delirious experience. And both of those segments are towards the end of the film, and there's a lightness to it. And not to say that I'm against the lightness. I mean, at times that's kind of necessary, but it just feels very disjointed and just out of place compared to a lot of the rest of it, especially when it's escalating right after to this big climax, which is the Night on Bald Mountain sequence. That one paired with the Ave Maria segment after that, those two are my absolute favorite parts of the entire film. To me, the animation here is just, it's at peak levels. It is so rich and gorgeous, and those colors and the designs of the creatures are just so fucking cool. It's so macabre, and they just go for it. I mean, you've got these creatures and the dead rising from the graves, the fiery figures, of course, the Chernobog monster, whatever, it looks incredible. And the skeleton ghosts on horses. It just so far surpasses expectations. I mean, I'm sure if I was watching Disney at the time in 1940, I'd be like, wow, this is so beyond Snow White and Pinocchio, the two previous films, which both those films have hints of the grotesque and the macabre. But this one just goes so much harder. To me, it's like the ego death. It is the climax, the moment of letting go and facing mortality and all of that, which is why I think it's so brilliantly contrasted with the Ave Maria segment that immediately follows it, which is everything that the Bald Mountain segment is not. Ave Maria is this quiet, angelic, very beautiful piece of music that sort of, it feels like it's lifting us into the afterlife and into a sort of rebirth. It's so peaceful, but in a way it feels poignant. It feels as like you're accepting something after going through something very difficult, and a lot of emotion has come out of you. Like an intense peak, and then it's over, and suddenly it's very, very quiet. There's something about the simplicity of the colors and the simplicity to the animation when you contrast it to the rich detail of the Bald Mountain one. That to me is so effective. The simplicity of light mixed with color and the quietness is, to me, makes me very emotional. It's just mesmerizing, and it's proof to me that, and I wish more people went by this, that you need very little sometimes to be effective. Less is more. This, in a way, can be a sort of blank slate where you just simply allow yourself to feel it. And I know that Ave Maria is, of course, a religious piece of music, but this doesn't feel like propaganda. It doesn't feel pointed in saying that you should believe this or that. You just sort of see the colors and everything, and you project onto it whatever you want to feel. It's the most viscera I've ever felt from a Disney film, for sure. And that's the power of it, even if it is a little bit disjointed at times. You know, I'm also not a fan of the narration in between each of the segments. I feel like it just goes on way too long at times. I mean, he'll just talk and talk and talk about the piece, and you're just kind of like, it's just not very necessary. And I feel like a lot of the information he's giving you, we don't really need. But overall, this is still, the majority of the film for me is a very special journey. The kind you know that when you watch it, it's like, yeah, they never made anything like this before, and they probably will never make anything like it afterwards. Yes, you can argue that Fantasia 2000 is similar. That film came out 60 years later, and it was meant to be a sort of sequel to this one. But it doesn't work for me. While there are moments in it that are very impressive, there are a couple segments I like. Overall, it's not nearly as bold, and it misses that meditative, very psychedelic quality, and it goes more for the cheap sentiment, for the easy narratives. It is clearly defined, and it doesn't really lull you into anything. While a lot of it is really beautifully drawn, and a lot of those images still stick with me, I feel like these animators and just the creators in general they were too afraid to go as far as the original, too afraid to rely on true abstraction, true silence, and to just go for the jugular. It remains more surfacey, more well-packaged, and so in a way, I consider that, yeah, a key example of how there will never be another Disney movie like Fantasia. The public just doesn't have the attention spans for it, and they're not going to sit there for such long periods of time while nothing is happening, because that sort of thing, it forces you to reflect and fully take in a sensory experience. If you allow yourself to just take it in, you know, tune in, tune out, all that good stuff, you'll see that those sensory experiences, those meditative sequences can open you up in ways that clearly defined narratives can't. It can allow for deeper emotion to come through. It's because you're stripping away the barriers of what you know, and you're, in a way, you're giving up that control. For me, just as a person, as a viewer, that's an exciting prospect and something that I really enjoy. And if you're that kind of person, then I'd say this movie is for you. Or what I often hear is that, a lot of people say, oh yeah, I remember seeing that movie as a kid. I remember certain parts of it, but I haven't seen it since. And it's like, this is one of those movies where I think it is perfect for children. I think it's absolutely perfect for children. But at the same time, as you get older, it's one of the few movies where when you watch it, it feels very similar to the way it did as a child. And I cannot think of any other Disney movie where I feel that quite to that extent. Yes, I've evolved, I've matured, but the feeling of watching this movie is meant to be childlike, removed from expectation. And so there's this sort of naivete where you're just taking it all in. And that to me is one of the most beautiful things about art, and why I think this is such an important movie. And that's my review. Thank you all for listening. All my social media information is below. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.